Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, May 5th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.
Yeah, before going to the conflict in Ukraine, Yemenis could hit the Ben Gurion airport in Israel. This is to understand the importance of this and how devastating is this sort of attack is that this airport is heavily protected by the air defense system of Israel. How do you see this situation? And right after this attack, Benjamin Netanyahu, Donald Trump, they're accusing Iran that they're helping Yemen. But who's providing the bombs to the missiles, everything to Israel? It's the United States. But when you see two parties, Israel and Yemen, do you think that Yemen is getting better? Is because the way that they're fighting the United States in the Red Sea, it seems that they're getting better and they're hitting and shooting down and MQ-9 Reapers and all of that, and right now hitting the most important airport in Israel. Your take, Carl?
Well, first of all, what we can see is that they have de facto create a kind of a no-fly zone over Israel because, of course, no civilian airlines would take the risk to get hit by some a missile in on the Ben Gurion airport. Therefore, it's a de facto kind of a deterrent for other, let's say, civilian airlines to use Ben Gurion Airport. And the what we can see behind or between the lines is that all those missiles, that THAAD system, the Arrow system, and all that are ineffective against Yemeni systems, which raise some questions, by the way. If you think, because Yemen was never considered as a high-tech country, has never been credited for having a very sophisticated armament. And despite this, they are able to challenge one of the most so-called high-tech country in the Middle East with the most advanced air defense system that you may have. And that question, in that sense, not just the capabilities of Israel, but also the capability of the US. Um, so here we have an interesting aspect. The most dramatic dimension of that is that we know why Yemen do it. In fact, Yemen is implementing exactly the principle of the responsibility to protect. That is a principle of the United Nations, because they said they will use these kind of a missile or airborne blockade against Israel as long as Israel doesn't comply with international law and with the accepted ceasefire. Previously it was to force Israel into a ceasefire negotiation with the Palestinians, and now they want to force Israel to come back to this agreement because obviously Israel broke the agreement it signed. And therefore, what Yemen is doing is in reality to force Israel to implement what it signed and the international law. But from departing from there, there are two very tragic conclusions of that. First is that nobody in the West has really understood the move of the Yemenis. And that's mostly because of Israeli propaganda, in fact. And nobody has catch the idea of the Yemenis, and probably to act to prevent those acts of, because Yemen has done that because there were no other reaction worldwide, and especially from the West. Had the West taken some measures to force Israel to stop its war, or the way it waged war in the Gaza Strip, probably Yemen would not have used that mean to force Israel to comply. So that's the first aspect: is the total inability of the West to understand what's going on and to, let's say, intervene in favor not just of the Palestinians, but in favor of the human international law, the international humanitarian law. It's about this. It's not about. I mean, obviously, you can see it as a matter of Palestinians and Hamas and all that, but if we go a level above, it's about the implementation of international humanitarian law. And this is the value. I mean, the values of what we claim our values in Europe is not the Palestinian cause or things like this. The values is international law. I mean, one of the value we claim to have. But interestingly enough, no international country, Western country, and that includes my country, Switzerland, has really taken advantage of being outside of the conflict to intervene in favor of the implementation of the international law. I mean, you may have some declaration here and there, but there is no concrete action to to implement that. In fact, if you look at my country, Switzerland, for instance, on the contrary, they decided that from the 15th of May, I think, if I'm not wrong, they declare Hamas as a terrorist organization from the 15th of May. So, meaning that they are going exactly in the same direction of Israel. The question is not to know whether Hamas is terrorist or not. By the way, terrorist, or the designation of a terrorist organization, is a political move. It's obviously not something based on facts. It's a political move. But we know that by designating Hamas as terrorist organization will, in fact, how to say that, create an incentive for Israel to go even stronger against Palestinians. So, in that sense, we see that we are not working in favor of the international humanitarian law, but on the contrary, we are trying to reinforce the ability of Israel to fight against Palestinians. Because although formally, technically speaking, the fact that Hamas is designated a terrorist organization and the way Israel waged the war, these are issues that are not really connected. But Israel make the connections, because for them, the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization is, in fact, that legitimize the use of any kind of weapon against the Palestinians, including, as we have heard from Annalena Baerbock, the former German foreign minister, that since there you have terrorists among the Palestinians, then this population doesn't deserve to be protected by international law. So when you designate the Hamas as terrorist organization, in fact, you have you are helping or legitimizing the way Israel makes its war. And we have this situation with the Yemenis as well. So that's the first aspect. The second aspect is that when you hear the rhetoric now in the US as in Israel, they don't care about Yemen, but they use that as a pretext to attack Iran. And that's an interesting aspect. That shows that Israel has a kind of I don't know. It's a psychotic understanding of the relation with Iran, because first of all, uh, Yemen is not a proxy of Iran. When you talk about a proxy, and we use this word especially when it comes to Hezbollah and to the Ansar Allah, that means that these entities, Hezbollah or Ansar Allah, are implementing Iran's policy. That's the definition of a proxy. That's a third party that implements the policy for one of the two parties of the conflict. But here we're not exactly in that model. The Yemeni decided by themselves to take the defense of the Palestinians. When Iran was challenged by Israel, by the different actions that were, or we could say even provocations from Israel to Iran, Iran reacted in a very measured way and didn't took the opportunity to start a war, or a missile war, or you can, or an air war, you can define this kind of war, in order to defend or to protect or to play in favor of the Palestinians. The Iranians have always privileged the diplomatic approach to that, although they have no contact with Israel, but using proxies and having kind of an advocacy type of policy to address the Palestinian question. But Iran is not. First of all, we have also to understand, and I remember, but that was probably 10 years ago or more, that the Saudis used to say that the Palestinian issue is not an Iranian issue. And I think the Iranians are on the same line. The Palestinians issue is not an Iranian issue. On religious grounds, but also on cultural, on ethnic grounds. There is no connection between the Palestinians and Iranians fundamentally. These are two different cultures. You know better than me that Iranian is a Farsi and Persian culture, while the Palestinians are obviously an Arabic culture, which is very different. And so when you look at the conflict from an Iranian perspective, you don't see any relation. Of course, they are concerned about what's happening in Palestine. And of course, they consider that Israel is misbehaving when it doesn't respect the international humanitarian law regarding the Palestinians. But at the same time, it's not their conflict. They have a lot of other issues to solve rather than the Palestinian ones. So we have here, and in that sense, it makes almost more sense for the Yemenis to address the Palestinian issue than for the Iranians. So here, I think it's a wrong perception when we say that the Yemenis are doing these attacks on Israel on behalf of Iran. I think it's a wrong acceptation, even if probably Iran considers that the Yemenis' actions are okay. I mean, they are justified or legitimate. But here in the U.S. and in Israel, they are taking advantage of this to find a pretext to attack Iran. And that's even more important than recently. I think we have mentioned that on your show recently, that the annual report, the threat report of the Director of National Intelligence, today's Tulsi Gabbard, she presented that in April. And in this report, it's written that Iran has not the nuclear weapons, has no intent to build a nuclear weapon, and it has stopped thinking about having a nuclear weapons in 2003. So it's more than 20 years that Iran has no nuclear weapons, has no intention to have nuclear weapons, but the Western rhetoric, remember that Donald Trump was the one withdrawing from the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in 2018 or 17, or I don't remember. And on the basis that Iran may have nuclear weapons. And of course, this is also a claim from Israel, meaning that, in fact, the US government is just taking over the claims of the Israeli government. And for the Israelis, this is also a pretext to start a new war in the region. That's all. So that's a matter of concern. And we see today, or those days, have seen some articles in the U.S. Press that some people would like Tulsi Gabbard to change the text of the threat assessment because now, of course, they don't have any rationale to attack Iran, since it is the CIA and other intelligence agencies have stated that there is no risk of no nuclear risk with Iran. So now they want to change the formulation of the threat. So we're coming in a very insane situation where we tend to portray the threat not based on what the threat actually is, but based on what we would like to do. So we want to have a war, therefore we have to portray Iran as a real threat. And that's extremely concerning. I think this is extremely concerning. And we have witnessed that already with Israel in the past years. I remember that was in 2012, if I'm not wrong, when Benjamin Netanyahu presented at the UN General Assembly the famous sketch of a bomb, and that was the limit. And he said that Iran was 2 weeks ago, or 2 weeks away from having the nuclear bomb or something like that. And just a couple of weeks later, there was a leak from the Mossad saying that there is absolutely no indication whatsoever that Iran has any intent to build a nuclear weapon, and that it has not the capacity to produce a nuclear weapon. And that was a document leaked by the Mossad or by someone, but it came conveniently just a few weeks after Benjamin Netanyahu made this claim in the General Assembly, showing that we have here an Israeli government that is very keen to put oil on fire, that wants, in fact, to have a regional conflict in the Middle East in order to have a significant involvement of the US in the region. And that's all these games with that play with the narrative in order to have this kind of picture of a threat, this picture of a threat. This is, I think, extremely disturbing. And I could add a new aspect of that, is that you have absolutely no European country, including the European Union, who is able to intervene in that discussion. We see that the Europeans are totally absent from the discussion. And that's something we have repeatedly said in this show, that the European diplomacy that can be at European level, I mean, European Union level, or at individual countries level, has absolutely no influence whatsoever, no presence even on the discussion in the Middle East. And that's something that disturbs me very deeply, because we may, I mean, again, I'm not taking here a position in favor of the Americans, but we can, let's assume, let's accept that the Americans may have some national interest in disrupting Iran. Let's assume that. Then, of course, they follow this national interest and they adjust the narrative to this national interest. Okay, that's what they did for Iraq, by the way. They wanted to invade Iraq, and therefore they adjusted the narrative in order to justify the intervention in Iraq. They may do the same for Iran. The problem is that how come European countries who have absolutely no interest in having a disrupted Middle East, or having an unstable Middle East, or having unstable relationship with Iran, for instance, or whoever in the Middle East, why do they support this? This is the real concern. I mean, we have the US. They fight everybody, and they fight Russia, they fight China, and they have their own way of presenting things, and they have their own way of looking at things. Okay, we are not. I'm not in the head of Donald Trump or his team, and I will not be able to change their mind. They have this national interest, at least that's in their perception, that they should fight against China and so on. Why for the European should we have exactly the same interest? I mean, obviously, we see that what the US considers as national interest is a problem for the rest of humanity. So how come our diplomacy, or diplomacies, even in a plural form, because there are many European countries and there are also supranational institutions such as European Union, but others. I can address the UN, I can address the OSCE, I can address various organizations, which, by the way, have all of them. That applies to the European Union, that applies to NATO, that applies to OSCE. They have a so-called Mediterranean dialogue. That means they have a dialogue with countries that are in the Middle East, like Jordan and North Africa. So there is an interest, essentially, for these European countries and European organizations to have a stable relationship with this area, including with Israel, by the way. So why are we unable to bring some kind of rationality in the dialogue, or not the dialogue, but the discussion regarding Iran and all that? Because we know, European countries are part of the IEA organization, so they know what IEA knows about the nuclear situation of Iran. We know that Iran is not looking at having a nuclear weapon. We know that enrichment activities of Iran have a commercial purpose. We know all that. So how come are we not able to influence both the Americans and especially Israel, because on Israel we may have leverage. Europe may have less leverage on the US, but it has leverage on Israel. Why are we not trying to help in solving the situation? Because we have psychotic leaders in Israel who need to have enemies to have the support of the international community, and that's a real problem. They feel they need to have this the compassion of the rest of the world in order to have the support. But how come should we come to that point? You know, Switzerland has good support in the world, but it doesn't need to have war for that. It's just by behaving properly, by respecting international law, then you will have the respect and the support of others. Why is that not possible for Israel? Um, so this is something that worries me as a European, to see how weak is the European diplomacy when it comes to conflict in which they are not directly involved in. That applies to Ukraine as well, by the way. But here we have, of course, some other factors. If you look at the Baltic states, Estonia, and so on, they have kind of a psychotic approach to Russians, and this has obviously influenced the European Union, and there is probably an explanation. But as it comes to the Middle East, it's we have more distance, both intellectually and physically, geographically. Therefore, we could afford to have a balanced view on the conflict and have a better approach to both parties. In addition to that, Europe has essentially no issues with Iran. The Americans are still influenced by what happened in 1979 with the US embassy that was occupied by those Pasdarans or whoever it was. And therefore, there is still this idea that Iran is the enemy. And of course, the Shah was expelled or forced to quit. And that still affects the perception of the Americans. But how come the Europeans should adopt the same policy towards Iran as the US? At the end of the day, we were not really affected by the change that happened in Iran. But we complied with every single sanction that was applied by the US, while all measures decided by the US, without having this ability to say, well, that's your problem, guys. No, our problem is to have a stable relationship with Iran or whoever. And we see the contrast between what the European diplomacy is able to, as regard what you have in the Middle East, where you have even the Saudis now having a normal and stable relationship with the Iranians, meaning that the Middle East is able to do things that the Europeans are not able to do. And that's something that concerns me, because it shows that you have in other parts than the West, I mean, the rest of the world, essentially, you have a maturity in addressing issues which is much more developed than in Europe. Europeans today, in the various conflicts we have, it can be with China, it can be with Russia, it can be with Iran, it can be with the Palestinians and all that. The Europeans have a childish approach to it, really childish. It's primary school level. all the leaders in Europe are intellectually immature. I mean, look at Emmanuel Macron, look at all these guys. It's immaturity. They change mind every second day. They don't have a vision of what they want to achieve. They don't have, since they don't have a vision, they cannot have objectives. Since they don't have objectives, they cannot have a strategy. And that's exactly the problem. I mean, as we have discussed already once, I mean, the US has a vision, which is, I think, wrong, but they have at least a vision. They have objectives. The problem is that they don't have a strategy to address these objectives. But at least they have that somehow. But the Europeans have neither nor. And that is, I think, something which should be a source of concern for everybody. To have leaders who lead without having any set direction.
Yeah. Colonel, we have the case of Ukraine, and it seems that as time goes by, Donald Trump, even his administration, is feeling that they're not somehow capable of putting an end to the conflict. Here is what Donald Trump said in his latest interview on MSNBC.
Minerals deal with Ukraine. It's a sign, it seems, that the United States is invested in Ukraine's future. The Secretary of State told me this is a very critical week. Are you any closer to reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
I hope so.
How would you characterize
I do believe we're closer with one party and maybe not as close with the other, but we'll have to see. I'd like to not say which one we're closer to, but we did do a deal for the American people that was good. We were able to get rare earth. You know, the Europeans are getting paid back. They have a loan. We didn't. Biden just gave him $350 billion. He has no idea where the money is, what happened. And at least we'll, in one form or another, get our, I don't feel so foolish. And remember this is Biden's war. This was a war that was never going to happen if I were president. This is a horrible, horrible war. And I get to see shots of soldiers through, satellite that are just so terrible. 5,000 soldiers are being, look, 5,000 soldiers a week on average are dying. They're not American soldiers, but I want to solve the problem. They're Russian soldiers and they're Ukrainian soldiers. And if I can save 5,000 souls, I just love doing it.
How long do you give both countries before you're going to walk away?
Well, there'll be a time when I will say, okay, keep going, keep being stupid.
When does that come? Are you close to it?
Sometimes I get close to it and then positive things happen, okay?
What's the red line for you? At what point do you say, that's it, we're walking away?
Well, you'll know. I mean, there'll be a time when I may say that. And if I do, there may be something I can't, maybe it's not possible to do. There's tremendous hatred, just so you understand. Kristen, we're talking tremendous hatred between these two men and between, some of the soldiers, frankly, between the generals. They've been fighting hard for 3 years. I think we have a very good chance of doing it.
Colonel, when you look at the interview where she's so desperate to hear Donald Trump saying that we're going to leave the conflict, we're going to get out of it, because she wants, as I perceive, she wants the conflict to continue. But when it comes to Donald Trump, he's totally, the ignorance of his comments in terms of this is the Biden's war and this is not my war. He was totally involved in what's going on in Ukraine for years. And right now, the solution, I'm getting the deal for the United States because Europe has those frozen assets of Russia. They can deal with that. We don't have that. We have to do something else to benefit from this case of Ukraine. And he has no solution for that. He says the total hatred between Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. This is not the issue. The issue is much deeper than what he's talking about. It's unbelievable the way that the president of the United States is picturing the conflict.
Well, absolutely, you're absolutely right, and this is part of the problem, is that we address problems not on the base of what they are, but on the base of our perception. I mean, we have created a narrative regarding the conflicts that applies both to the conflict we were talking about before. I mean, we talked about Iran. I mean, we have we have objective a report from the IAEA or CIA saying there is no nuclear weapons, but you have a narrative that says there are nuclear weapons, and therefore we have to adjust the reality in order to comply with the narrative. And we have the same thing with Ukraine. I mean, the way we understand the conflict. I mean, this is something that have said many times on probably on your show and others. In any case, the way you understand the conflict explains or defines the ways you solve it. So if you don't understand the conflict, you don't solve it. If you understand it wrong, you solve it wrongly, or you don't solve it, basically. So this is the reality. This is the first issue here: understanding the conflict. And obviously, when the Trump team, I'm not saying administration, but let's say the team, because it's very limited to a very small group of individuals. And when we talk about Ukraine, it is definitely centered on Keith Kellogg, and now it's Steve Witkoff. But we're talking about very, very small amount of people. In any case, when they addressed, or they wanted to address, the conflict with the project of Keith Kellogg was not understanding the conflict at all. He had a perception of the conflict, and he wanted to solve it in the way he understood it, but he hasn't understood it, as many military people, by the way, in the West, because this is the old generation generals who hate the Soviets and the commies and the Russians, and this is still the same thing. So therefore, we address the Russia today as we wanted to use or to address the Soviets 30 years ago. This is exactly the same problem. Therefore, sometimes there are intellectual adjustments that didn't happen. And we have exactly that with Keith Kellogg. And that's the reason why he put in place some ideas to solve the problem, but it was based on his understanding of the issue rather than a deep analysis of what the conflict is about. Now, the issue is that a conflict can stop, and that applies to any kind of conflict, by the way. It can be solved in two ways. The first one is on the negotiation table. The second one is by a decisive victory of one of the parties. Now, we have here in Ukraine, we have Ukraine doesn't want to negotiate, and the Europeans don't want Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. And they are not even happy that Trump might be talking to Russia. So we have a Western party that is adverse to any kind of negotiation. On the Russian side, they have always said that they are ready to have negotiation at certain conditions. And these were the conditions that were set by Vladimir Putin on the 14th of June 2024. So we know that they are ready for discussion under certain conditions. But the fact of the matter is that the Europeans don't want to talk, period. That's it. Now, if you just consider that, when I mentioned the two possibilities for ending a conflict, then you have the first one that is just fading away. So the other solution is to have a decisive victory. The problem is that the decisive victory probably early March 2022, we might have a situation where probably Ukraine might have a chance, but I even doubt of it. But I think it was the question was solved or decided already in the first days of the Russian military offensive, military special operation. In any case, today, thinking about Ukraine having a decisive victory over Russia, I think is simply fantasy. We may probably have we can talk about the nature of this victory. We can talk about the intensity of the defeat or the intensity of the victory, or we can discuss about all that. But what is almost certain is that Ukraine will not be able to reverse the situation and push the Russian back to the borders of 2014, 2022, or 1991, depending on what kind of borders you are talking about. So this is excluded. The only thing that Ukraine can do is addressing issue, probably making some havoc in the during the military parade this week or something like that. But they will not be able to reverse the situation. Therefore, we are heading towards a decisive victory of Russia. And that's where you can see the irrationality of the Western approach here. And when I say Western, I would say European approach. Now, the US and Trump has at least this idea. I mean, first of all, Trump wants to get to walk away from this conflict. It's a burden, it's a liability, and his focus is China in order to make America great again. Therefore, all these conflicts that are spending money for nothing with no return on investment at large, it's not getting some cents as in return of every dollar spent. It's not that, but it has not. It's not bringing any political reward, no geopolitical reward, no. It's just deteriorating a situation. It brings nothing back in return. Therefore, there is no need to continue the conflict. Therefore, we have to walk away. But he doesn't want to walk away as Joe Biden did in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. He doesn't want to go suddenly like this and everything fall into a chaotic situation. He would like to have some kind of settlement before leaving. I think that's the approach. That's the reason why he tries to have the two parties agreeing on a kind of a situation where it is, I mean, you have some calm, I would say, let's put it that way. Probably not peace, but calm, and so he can leave in good conscience, I would say. I mean, good conscience with quotation marks, because as you rightly pointed out, in fact, this conflict started with Obama, continued under the Trump administration, was exacerbated under the Biden administration, and today we are in the situation. And in fact, all the last four presidents all of them made the situation worse. So there is no exception there. So he has a responsibility. But the idea of trying to have an embryo of negotiation, a start of solution for the conflict, is at least a good intention. Let's give that as a credit to Trump. And the problem is that nobody in the West has understood now, or doesn't want to understand, the situation in which Ukraine is. And what we have heard recently, Vladimir Putin saying that if there is no discussion, then he will just finish Ukraine off. And that's exactly what we may see in the next future. Again, there are rumors that you have kind of armies and forces that are getting ready for whatever in Russia. I don't know if it is for a future operation. I have absolutely no idea. Is it for other purposes? I have no idea. But the fact of the matter is that Russia has capacity to make the thing worse for Ukraine. And people should try to understand that. And the more we delay a dialogue, or the start of a dialogue, or some kind of a process to solve the situation, the more chance we have to have Ukraine into a situation which is worse. So I give the credit to Trump that he tries to do something. The problem is that, as you rightly said, he doesn't understand the conflict. The conflict was not, let's say, triggered by NATO or whoever. Even if NATO comes as a background issue, which is very important for Russia, but it's not the reason why Russia entered Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. The issue is the Russian minority and the rights of the minority in Ukraine. This is the key aspect. And in fact, what happened in February 2022 is that as was explained by Alexei Arestovich in March 2019, Zelensky wanted to use, or let's say, yes, to use a defeat with the help of the West, with sanctions and all that, massive sanctions on Russia. He wanted to defeat Russia, probably to have a regime change or government change, however you call it, in Russia, in order to be able to enter NATO, because it was not possible for Ukraine to enter NATO as Ukraine had this conflict, this open conflict with Russia. Open conflict was not really a conflict, by the way. It was the West that said that there was a conflict, because there was no open conflict with Russia. It was a conflict with the Russian minorities in Ukraine. And of course, with the potential threat of Russia intervening, as it did in Georgia in 2008, and that's exactly the scenario that was used to force Russia to enter Ukraine, and that's the situation. Force. It was not Russia was not forced, but let's say it was an incentive for Russia to intervene, and that's exactly what Arestovich explained in 2019. And we have that applied. So the background remains NATO, but the real reason for intervening is the situation of the minorities. And if you listen to the recent interview of Lavrov, this is always the first reason he mentions, and the first, let's say, objectives he mentions when addressing the situation is the status of the Russian minorities or minority in Ukraine. So that's the major point. So that means that if we want to address this issue, if we wanted to have a political solution to the conflict, of course, the Minsk Agreement was, in fact, patterned around the issue of the minorities. And that would have been the ideal political settlement of the conflict. But since 2022, if we want to have a solution, it has to address this minority situation. And that's, interestingly enough, that's something that nobody in Europe is mentioning, and not even the Trump team, by the way. And that's also something that is not really addressed by the Keith-Kellogg plan. We see that it's a very, I would say, a pedestrian plan, where you see military advance and you say, okay, you have advance up to there, and that will be the line of contact, which is the base for a future agreement and all that. It's a very pedestrian approach. And this pedestrian approach conflicts with what exactly Lavrov said in his recent interview with CBS, by the way, when it's underlined the need for addressing the deep or the root causes of the conflict. And the root cause of the conflict is the situation of the minority. And that's, by the way, we have heard that again from the Hungarian side. I have mentioned that several times, that Hungary has exactly the same problem with Hungarian minority in the west of the country. So it's not just when we talk about minorities in Ukraine, it's not, we talk about the Russian one because obviously it's the largest one, but the same problem affects the other minorities. The Romanian minority also in the west of the country, but more importantly, the Hungarian minority is a little bit larger than the Romanian one in the Galician, not the Galician, it's Transcarpathia area. So we have Hungary complaining again about the right of the minority. So Ukraine has a problem not just with the Russian minority, but with all minorities. Because, of course, what happened in 2014 is that you had an ultra-nationalist type of government in reality that came into place. And it's a type of, let's say, an ideology with various degrees, all do not deserve, not all of them deserve the title of neo something, and not all of them are ultranationalists in the sense of these ideologies of the 30s in Germany, but it's still nationalistic in the sense that it's a government, and we can see the law that was adopted in July 2021 that makes a difference, an ethnic difference between citizens, and that shows exactly that we have a nationalist approach to the population, which has to be addressed at one point. And that's exactly what the Russians are aiming at. And that's the reason why the Russians will not talk about getting or giving the four region back to, I'm talking about Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. They will not give that back to Ukraine because of the status of the minorities. And probably they may consider, I'm not in the mind of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, or even obviously Vladimir Putin, but I can imagine that they may contemplate the idea of having also other Russian, let's say, Russian strong, put it that way, regions such as Odessa, Nikolaev, maybe Dnipropetrovsk, but Nikolaev and Kherson. That's already in the four region that Russia considers as his territory, but Nikolaev and Odessa may be the an objective for Russia, because there you have a significant Russian presence. So
Colin,
these,
could that go to Kiev? Because one of the main concern on the part of Russia, as Peskov mentioned, is that the Ukrainian army is not in full control of Kiev, and the Zelensky administration doesn't have that sort of capacity to control the Ukrainian army in its entirety. But do you feel that at the end of the day, Russia would go beyond the front line, go to Kiev and to follow the Ukrainian government? Because that would be somehow politically, I'm talking about, not militarily capturing, but the only solution that would be the substantial for Russia would is the political parties in Kiev, and who's gonna run Kiev and Ukraine in the aftermath of any sort of setup. That's why I think that Kiev is so much important for Russia right now, if they're not capable of controlling everything on their part.
well, I think it's a very good question. The Russians obviously are concerned about the political leadership, and they would probably welcome a change in the political leadership, and having something that reflects more, let's say, a less nationalistic approach to the governance. I'm not sure that Russia is ready to intervene, let's say physically. I'm not even saying militarily, but physically, to have this change. They probably hope that the changing situation on the field will trigger changes on the political scene, and that's probably what they expect. And therefore, there is a link between the situation on the ground and the political situation, because they feel that, and that's probably what they are contemplating, this idea of, if they gain more territory, if they gain more control over some regions of Ukraine, that will provoke some changes in Kiev. And we have seen that already. We have seen some signs of it. And when of course, the media don't show much about this, but there's a lot of actions from the security services to suppress any kind of opposition in Ukraine. I mean, I'm in Ukraine, in the Kiev-controlled Ukraine, if you want. And so there are some moves. I mean, probably Zelensky understands that the changing situation on the battlefield may influence the political change in the country, and that's something that may happen. But I'm not sure the Russians will do actively something towards this, because they expect that at one point the Americans will probably come and say, no, we need a change. And there have been some rumors about this, both in the US and in the UK, especially when it comes to making Zaluzhny as an alternative to Zelensky and probably others. But and I don't know if this will materialize or not, but there have been some rumors, and probably this is what may happen. That means that by pressing or increasing the pressure on the Ukrainian forces will in fact create a political problem in Kiev. That's probably what they want to do. I'm not sure the Russians will come. I mean, there were some ideas that they may come back with how's this name, Medvedchuk, and bring him back. But I'm not sure the Russians are keen to do that, because if this person would come into power or be forced into power in some way, it will always be the Russian man, and I'm not sure this is a sign, or let's say a guarantee for stability. The Russians want a stable government, and probably people need now to understand in Ukraine what are the challenges for the future, and based on that, they should understand that probably it's, let's say, it's probably good to go back to some kind of, I would say, democracy, because in the last couple of years, especially in the last 2 years, Ukraine has shifted towards something which is not exactly democracy. And probably Ukraine should go back to this, and that will bring some kind of stability in the country. You have more and more people in Ukraine who think that this war should end. You have more and more people who think that the Ukraine should be able to give up some land and abandon those land to Russia. They also understand that the leadership of Zelensky is not always very rational. So you have some changes in the mindset of Ukrainian politicians in Ukraine. Therefore, that's probably what the Russians are trying to promote, not by covert action and things like this, but more by using the leverage of the battlefield. The battlefield is a huge leverage, in fact, because in order to feed the battle, the Ukrainians are, in fact, condemned to use more and more forced recruitment. This is enormously unpopular in Ukraine, and in fact, you have many. I have mentioned that probably on your show a couple of times, but you have resistance movements, Ukrainian resistance movement, not Russian resistance movement, Ukrainian resistance movement, who are in fact resisting this forced recruitment policy, but by doing so, they are also fighting the Ukrainian armed forces, and they are also connecting with Russian resistance movement, who are also active in the western part of Ukraine. This is what we see. Therefore, they are, and that explains also the activity or increased activity of the Ukrainian security services in the last year or so, and especially in the last month. They arrest a lot of people who are designated as FSB agent or Russian agent and so on. But in fact, they are Ukrainians. And these are Ukrainians who are opposed to this recruitment policy. The problem is that the Ukrainian government is condemned to use forced recruitment because they don't have enough fighters on the ground. So the situation slowly is changing in Ukraine, and we may have political changes due to the Russian pressure on the battlefield. You see, that's the interesting part of it.
Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great
That
pleasure
was
as always.
that was my
And
pleasure. Thank you
just
very much.
before wrapping up this session, let me just remind the people here we have here we have two channels in Dialogue Works clips, and we're gonna put the clips from 10 to 50 minutes on this channel. Please help us to improve this channel. And we have the Acast, and all the audio files are going to be uploaded in the Acast, and you can follow us on Acast as well. Thank you so much. Yeah. Carl,
Okay.
again, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, and have a good week. Thank you.
Yeah.